Hey folks, last week we talked about the first part of this project, the analysis section, and you guys have produced some really nice work. I've put comments on the work, so please have a look. Now I want to briefly touch on what we're going to do in the latter half of the paper. And so let's return to this generic thesis that we've been using for the assignment. I've crossed out all of the analysis section, and so now I just want to focus on parts 2 and 3. And in parts 2 and 3, there are basically 3 moves that are happening. Part 2 is one move, and that is that you're now trying to draw a conclusion based on all of the patterns that you've seen, and in that conclusion you're trying to highlight a specific value or ideology that you see undergirds the way that your discourse operates. And so this section of the paper is not a long section by any means. It's really maybe a paragraph or so that just allows you to get to clarify what that value or ideology is. And so I have an example that you can take a look at, and you can see it's one paragraph that clarifies the value or ideology. Now, part 3 has 2 big things that are happening, and this is really where the bulk of the second half of the paper occurs. And so here, the first thing that you're considering is you're considering other discourses that have a similar value or ideology that undergirds them. And so the idea here is that your paper starts pretty small, really specific, so to speak, and then you start to branch out a little bit. So if you're talking about the discourse of GNC, this is now where you build connections between GNC and other discourses that have similar values or ideologies underneath them. And so here, I'm looking to see that you can bring in those examples, whether you're bringing in quotations from other discourses, or maybe visuals from other discourses, or you hyperlink to another discourse, just so that you can draw those comparisons. And once you've done that, I then ask you to push the project just a little bit further. And this is the real work. This is where we're now thinking about the idea of how that value or that ideology works in the culture at large. And so I want to speak briefly about this idea of dominant discourses. And when we think about dominant discourses, I want you really to think about the institutions of power that exist. And so these are institutions like politics, or media and entertainment, or law, or education. These are the big hitters in the culture. And if we think about the values that exist in those major discourses, we can think that they actually exert a lot of influence into how other discourses then operate. That a lot of the values that now happen, right, or that are shared in these other discourses are coming from the influence of those dominant discourses in the culture. And so, I'm giving you just some ideas to think about. And in a sense, a lot of you guys have already shared the idea. So, for example, if you're talking about Tesla, or if you're talking about Cold Stone Creamery, and you start to have a conversation about sales, you're actually seeing that the dominant discourse of capitalism and business and the free markets is what's kind of handing out these values. And then we see how those values play out, right, in the smaller little examples. And so now in your paper, you're actually going to end on a conversation about capitalism. You're going to end on a conversation about the impact of the free market. And of course, you could use ideas from Fishing for Fools. But I know not everybody is thinking of discourses that necessarily connect to the free market. And I'm not forcing people to do that. And so here I've given you just a couple of examples to potentially consider. For some of you, you're actually seeing that your discourse is connected to this large cultural value of science. And in my case, in the GNC example, we can see that, right? That there's this language of science that's really important in the culture, and it's used in all sorts of different ways. You could think about religion and just how important religion works. Think about politics, right? You cannot have a candidate run who's not going to speak to religion to some extent. Right? You may also want to think about something like how important argument is in our culture, right? That we tend to turn lots of issues into divisive issues. Think about how polarized we are. Well, that has to do with this culture of argument. You could think about masculinized communication practices. You could think about the patriarchy and gender roles. You could think about the American dream. These are much bigger ideas, right? These bigger cultural ideas. And so at the end of your paper, you're bringing in ideas about that, right? You're having a much larger conversation. So I have an example that you can take a look at, and I also speak a bit more about this in the next little research video. Hope this helps. Take care.